and welcome to another episode of What Happened, which is about another game made by Rare, which is, I think maybe the 7th time we've done this song and dance. Make no mistake though, Rare is one of the most beloved studios of all time and a personal favorite of yours truly, having birthed a bevy of absolutely stone-cold classics throughout the 90s and a few in the early 2000s. But because of the trajectory of the studio, the way development teams were set up, and projects often being started right before new console generations were kicking off, well, they just have a whole lot of history worth discussing. And today's subject is no exception to that. So grab your greenest miniskirt and start fluttering your elf wings, because it's time for me to answer the question, what happened to Kameo Elements of Power?
Where am I?
The earliest work on Kameo started on the
Nintendo Ultra 64.
as the team that had brought Donkey Kong to Nintendo's third home console had been inspired by the meteoric rise of the Pokémon series, which was showing no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Rare used the concept of monster training as a jumping off point, allowing the player to capture, raise, and coach a menagerie of various fantasy creatures into battle. According to longtime Rare collaborator and Kameo game designer Chris Alcock, who was gracious enough to speak to me for this episode, while Kameo did exist on the Nintendo 64 at one point, it was far from what most would consider a game. They were basically just testing features and exploring technological possibilities, and it wouldn't truly become something of a game until after its jump to Nintendo's Indigo Lunchbox. Once that process started, they began fleshing out their ideas. In this GameCube iteration, Rare had built a large open island environment wherein Kameo would collect various fantasy creatures and bring them around the island while assigning them various tasks to help her adventuring. Once a gore block had been captured, the player could temporarily control them, gobbling up various items and/or food until it would evolve into a more powerful form. Kameo would then be able to summon that powered-up monster to fight for her, whacking and smacking the antagonistic trolls who populated the island. With the combat loop in place, the team, who numbered somewhere around 20 people, started building out proper levels and boss fights, which culminated in the GameCube version's only public showing, which was at E3 2001. Nintendo and Rare were so sure that Kameo would be completed on time that a screenshot of the game was actually included on the back of the GameCube's launch packaging, which released a few months later in November, which was then subsequently removed the following year for reasons that I'm sure most of you already know. As to why the GameCube version never made it onto the actual console in time, well, a possible explanation was that the team started to realize that Kameo, well, wasn't all that much fun. In the Rare revealed supplemental material on the game, designer Mark Stevenson explained, "We had all this kind of stuff where you would hunt down babies and catch them. It was pretty in-depth. You'd have to watch the behavior of the babies to understand them, to work out a strategy of how you were gonna catch them. You know, it just wasn't as exciting or as interesting as we hoped it was gonna be, so it kinda got pared back to the point where the baby capturing stuff didn't really happen at all, other than that you found the warriors when you did find them and rescued them from the shadow troll. They were kind of in a baby form then. I guess a big part of that was to make sure we got some use out of some of the work that was done." Originally, this GameCube version was to feature dozens upon dozens of different monsters, but when the team discovered it was more fun to directly control them in combat rather than just have Kameo watch them combating, they decided she should be able to morph into them at any time to wreak havoc. This meant that they had to dramatically cut down the number of planned beasties so they could concentrate on fleshing the survivors out to make them more unique from one another. So, just as the staff were finally honing in on what they felt were the most fun elements of their game, they got hit with the same curveball that I've talked about so many times before, Microsoft's purchase of Rare. Even when discussing a game that's literally all about transforming into something else, this was starting to get a bit much, because it meant that Kameo would have to go through yet another metamorphosis, and a whole new target platform. Or two. According to my conversation with Chris Alcock, Kameo's transition to Xbox brought about a good opportunity to focus the game on what worked and tweak it further towards something they felt would be better suited towards Xbox. In Kameo's case, of course, we realize that we have a brand new audience and thinking, we have a game that's a living fairy tale with a grumpy wizard in a storybook and a cute dragon, so let's cherry pick the environments and the ideas we can that will still fit, and rework everything else into something that has a place on Xbox. Kameo became an elf instead of a fairy, for example, her sassy dragon sidekick was removed, and the story needed reworking. Ah, right, a sidekick. There's not much surviving media of this character, but during the bulk of the game's development on the GameCube, Kameo had a wisecracking creature who tagged along with her throughout her adventure. A removal that I can't imagine many people will regret, because we all had more than our fill of that in Star Fox Adventures.
Fox! Fox! Help me, I can't move!
Speaking of the Lilat Wars, once SFA wrapped up, staff from that team then joined up on Kameo, bolstering their numbers, which they were going to need during that transition to the Xbox. This process of picking and choosing what would work and what wouldn't in terms of design and story, as well as moving the technology over to a new machine, took a fair bit of time, as you could imagine, but once that was taken care of, well, it was off to the races. The team were then able to expand and flesh out the world and scope even further due to the increased capabilities of the Xbox, which is where the vast majority of the work done on Kameo took place, largely resulting in the game we all know today. Hell, a development build of this version was even leaked a few years ago, and it honestly looks really dope and certainly shows just how far along the team got working on Microsoft's original hardware platform. By the time they started nearing the finish line, though, they were approached by MS producers who were aware of just how long the game had been in development, so the leaders of Kameo's development were offered a choice of how to proceed from there, something that Chris was able to explain to me in more detail. The team leads, George Andreas, Phil Tossel, and Mark Stevenson, were given the option to either finish for them what had already been a long development cycle, or to get the extra time and resources, but also pressure and carry the team and the game forward to being an Xbox 360 launch title. They chose the latter, and it allowed us to do so much more. The game didn't really have an overworld before then, it was a series of warps, a bit like Skyward Sword. With the time and resources of the Xbox 360, we got to introduce the Badlands and charging through troll armies on horseback. Previously vacant areas got reworked with voice NPCs who got full day and night cycles, as well as collectibles and currency to spend in their shops. Now, while that's great, this was a stark contrast to what happened to Perfect Dark Zero, which was put in the uncomfortable position of being the marquee next-gen launch title for the 360, as Halo 3 was going to miss that launch date by a not insignificant amount of time. Still though, you couldn't say it didn't benefit both products in the end, although you could argue that they might have eaten into each other's fan bases when they both hit store shelves in November of 2005. Despite adding a ton more to the world and design, to make that 360 launch day deadline, the Kameo team also had to cut back on a few specific things as well, including a set of wind-based elemental warriors, RIP to this awesome fucking cyclone dragon, due to the fact that they were running into complications with controllable flying creatures, as they would often cause design headaches since you could circumvent certain puzzles and entire sections of the levels. More graphical polish was obviously added to the game as well, including quality bumps in lighting, textures, and particularly particle effects for that authentic, ethereal fantasy feeling. The art team even attempted to have 1 million particle effects on screen at once, which, while sounding impressive, was apparently not great in practice. In the aforementioned rare revealed video, engineer Nick Burton admitted you literally couldn't see anything when 1 million dust particles were in play, so that number was dropped down to a more conservative 100,000. Still interesting to hear they could even manage such a thing at the time though. In the final months of tuning the game, Rare also made the conscious decision to start Kameo off with a bang, introducing the elemental warriors and the fact that she could morph into them in an attempt to hook players nice and early. This was in contrast to how a lot of similar adventures began, which was with the expected "I'm starting my adventure" tropes like box pushing, fetch questing, and long conversations. All that was left was to actually release the game, and with small touches like letting Xbox fans know that they would be controlling an elf and not, I repeat, not a fairy, along with the added Badlands sequences, the world was Kameo's to conquer, which was unfortunately a goal she did not achieve. Elements of Power garnered well above average scores from critics when it released alongside the likes of Perfect Dark Zero, Project Gotham Racing 3, and Condemned Criminal Origins. Can we get a new Condemned, please? Like, for fuck's sake, there's literally no reason why. Commercially, though, Kameo fared well for a 360 launch title, but didn't quite seem to perform the way Microsoft was expecting. Issue 122 of Retro Gamer magazine, in an article following lead programmer Phil Tossel's career, he stated that during its launch period, Kameo sold over 700,000 copies, though it's unclear where exactly this number comes from. When I asked about that figure, Chris informed me that he heard it had eventually surpassed that with over a cool million, without even counting Rare Replay, and anecdotally, he says he's heard from folks within his circle that it's been a quote, big hit on Game Pass. The problem, for Microsoft bean counters that is that 1 million was still a far cry from the 8 million copies shifted by GoldenEye, or the 3 million copies that the original Banjo-Kazooie had got to a few years earlier. Around 4 years would pass before word of any sort of sequel came, when in 2009, Computer and Video Games published an article that is now lost to time, which apparently claimed that Kameo 2 had been worked on for about 3 months, pitched to Microsoft in 2007, who then ultimately passed on it, which is something that Chris also confirmed to me. This is a shame though, because the Kameo team obviously did their damnedest to alter the world and its fantasy setting to better fit the 360's now established gamer bro demographic, with the timeless technique of giving everything a dark and gritty remodeling. Kameo ditched her wings, gained a sleeker, deadlier silhouette, and now stuck to the shadows, wielding a pair of pointy daggers. In this behind-the-scenes video, which shows off art and animation tests found on Rare Replay, we can see a lot of really cool costumes, character concepts, and mood pieces that really paint a darker but still thematically appropriate world. A new race of brutal serpentine warriors was going to be introduced, and even the evil trolls from their original Kameo were back with technological augmentations to their bodies to make them even tougher somehow. Yeah, now it's all blood and teeth, innit? Regardless of the thought and consideration put into this pitch, Microsoft were having none of it, with CVG stating that Rare then went through an internal restructuring and were now focusing on something called Project Natal. Natal? Why is that so familiar? Oh, the Kinect! I should have known, sorry. It's just been a long time since I've heard the camera's prototype name again. As for Chris Alcock, well, his view on the matter is a bit more nuanced. I think ultimately the reason it didn't go forward has a lot to do with what Rare's mantra is today: make games the world doesn't have. When it comes to deciding what games to make, Rare absolutely had and still has the talent to make a third-person action-adventure with monster transformations, or a sci-fi shooter, or a game where people throw ducks at balloons and nothing's the way it seems. Sea of Thieves is a game the world didn't have. Rare was uniquely positioned to make it, and it's gone on to be an incredible success that's still going, still growing, and still keeping me writing daft characters in the spirit of Kameo 20 years later. Regardless, we'll hopefully hear more about what the legendary studio's been up to at this year's Xbox Showcase, as it's been a long time since we've seen, well, anything outside of the steady waves of Sea of Thieves content. In fact, I believe the last time the Green Elf was ever acknowledged was from a specific ship's figurehead from Sea of Thieves, which, while nice, is quite frankly little more than a cameo. Ayy. Thanks again to Chris for adding his valuable insight into today's episode. If you know of any other fantastic fantasies that befell a fateful finale, let me know in the comments below or enter the Enchanted Kingdom, that is my Twitter. See you next time, and thanks for watching!
It's an everyday we're here to say, get ready for a all-star show. There's 13 games in our heart.